There are people right now typing out their deepest feelings into notes on their phone, pouring their heart into digital documents, writing letters they'll never send, journaling thoughts they'll never share, pages and pages of raw emotion that no one will ever read. And while you might think this is just private journaling, the psychology behind secret emotional documentation reveals something far darker about how certain minds process feelings when human connection feels too dangerous. Today, we're exploring why some people can only express emotions when they're certain no one will see them, and the neuroscience shows this isn't just about privacy, it's about a fundamental terror of being emotionally witnessed. Let me start with research that reveals just how common this behavior is. A 2020 study published in the journal Cyberpsychology, Behavior and Social Networking surveyed over 3,000 smartphone users about their private note-taking habits. They found that 68% of participants kept private notes containing emotional content. But here's what's striking. 43% of those individuals reported that these notes contained feelings they had never expressed to anyone, not friends, not family, not therapists. Their phone had become a vault for emotions too dangerous to share with actual humans. Before we dive deeper, you need to understand what's happening neurologically when someone writes versus when they speak emotions aloud to another person. Research published in 2019 in Social Cognitive and Affective Neuroscience used fMRI imaging to compare brain activity during emotional writing versus emotional conversation. When participants wrote about feelings privately, there was increased activation in the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, associated with cognitive control and organization. The act of writing engaged analytical processing, allowing people to structure and contain their emotions. But when expressing the same emotions verbally to another person, completely different regions activated. The amygdala showed heightened activity, processing the vulnerability and potential threat of being emotionally exposed. The anterior cingulate cortex activated, monitoring for signs of judgment or rejection. The temporoparietal junction engaged in mentalizing, constantly trying to predict what the other person was thinking. Verbal emotional expression to another human wasn't just communication. It was a high-stakes social performance that activated threat detection systems. For people who keep secret emotional notes, this threat response is amplified. Writing provides what psychologists call emotional processing without social risk. You can access, explore, and articulate your feelings without triggering the fear systems associated with being emotionally witnessed by another human. The page or screen becomes a safe container that won't judge, abandon, or use your vulnerability against you. A groundbreaking 2021 study from the University of Texas, published in the Journal of Personality, examined what they called expressive writing in isolation versus expressive disclosure to others. They recruited participants who regularly kept private emotional notes and compared them to people who readily shared emotions with others. The private writers showed significantly higher scores on measures of trust impairment, fear of vulnerability, and attachment anxiety. But here's what's crucial. They didn't show higher scores on alexithymia, the inability to identify emotions. This finding challenges a common assumption. These individuals weren't emotionally unaware or numb. They could identify and articulate their feelings with remarkable clarity when writing privately. The deficit wasn't in emotional awareness, it was in emotional trust. They could access their emotions. They just couldn't trust other humans with them. The notes represented a compromise, emotional expression without the danger of human witnessing. Now, let's talk about the developmental origins of this pattern. Research published in 2020 in Attachment and Human Development examined childhood experiences of people who kept secret emotional documentation. They found a striking pattern. 72% reported experiences where emotional expression in childhood was met with invalidation, punishment, or weaponization. Their emotions were dismissed as overreactions, used against them in arguments, or resulted in caregiver withdrawal. The child's brain learns a devastating lesson. Emotions are dangerous to express, but painful to suppress. The solution? Find a way to process emotions that doesn't involve other people. Early forms might be diaries hidden under mattresses, notes passed to yourself, imaginary friends who listened without judgment. As technology evolved, these became password-protected documents, private note apps, unsent drafts. The medium changed, but the function remained, creating a space where emotions could exist without human risk. Brain imaging studies of adults with these childhood histories show persistent alterations in neural circuitry. A 2019 study published in Developmental Cognitive Neuroscience found reduced connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala in individuals who had learned to suppress emotional expression in childhood. This means their cognitive control centers had difficulty regulating fear responses around emotional vulnerability. Even in safe relationships as adults, their amygdala would activate when considering emotional disclosure, triggering avoidance. Let's examine what's actually in these secret notes, because the content reveals important psychological functions. A 2021 qualitative study published in the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships analyzed the private emotional notes of 200 volunteers who agreed to share them anonymously for research. The researchers identified several categories of content, each serving a distinct function. The most common category was unsent letters, comprising 34% of notes. These were messages written to specific people, often expressing hurt, anger, love, or need that the writer knew they would never send. Brain imaging showed that writing these unsent letters activated similar neural regions as imagined social interaction, suggesting the brain was simulating the emotional disclosure without the actual risk. It was a way to practice vulnerability in a completely controlled environment. The second category was emotional dumping, making up 28% of notes. These were raw, unfiltered emotional expression without concern for coherence or audience. Participants described these notes as a release valve, a way to externalize overwhelming feelings without burdening others. The act of typing or writing the emotions provided physiological relief, measurably reducing cortisol and heart rate, even though no one would read them. The third category was self-dialogue, 22% of notes. These were conversations the person was having with themselves, often trying to make sense of confusing emotions, solve problems, or provide self-comfort. Neurologically, this engaged regions associated with mentalization and self-reflection. The person was essentially becoming their own therapist, their own confidant, because they couldn't trust others to perform those roles. A fascinating 2020 study in emotion examined what happens when people who keep private emotional notes are asked to share those notes with someone they trust. The researchers recruited participants who maintained secret emotional documentation and asked them to choose one note to share with a close friend or family member. The physiological response was striking. Heart rate increased an average of 28 beats per minute, skin conductance indicated sweating and stress, and cortisol spiked to levels comparable to public speaking anxiety. But here's what's interesting. After sharing the note, if the response was validating and non-judgmental, participants showed significant decreases in anxiety about emotional expression that persisted for weeks. However, if the response was dismissive, minimizing, or judgmental, participants reported increased commitment to keeping emotions private, often deleting the shared note and promising themselves never to risk that vulnerability again. One negative experience could reinforce years of emotional hiding. Research on the specific medium of digital notes provides important insights. A 2019 study published in Computers and Human Behavior examined why people choose phone notes, document files, or apps specifically designed for private journaling. The researchers found that the digital medium provided several psychological advantages over traditional paper journals. First, digital notes could be password protected or biometrically locked, providing security that paper journals lacked. Participants described memories of childhood diaries being read by parents or siblings, violating their private emotional space. Digital encryption provided a sense of safety that physical writing never could. Second, digital notes were always accessible. The phone was always present, meaning the emotional outlet was available whenever needed, unlike a journal that might be at home when emotions struck elsewhere. Third, and perhaps most psychologically significant, digital notes were invisible. No one could see you writing them. You could pour out your heart in a crowded coffee shop, on public transportation, in the same room as the person you were writing about, and no one would know. This invisibility allowed emotional processing without the social exposure that physical writing might create. The behavior could remain completely hidden. Let's talk about the neuroscience of secrecy itself, because maintaining secret emotional notes involves more than just the notes themselves. Research published in 2021 in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology examined what they called cognitive load of concealment. Keeping significant secrets requires mental resources. You have to remember what you've told whom, monitor conversations to avoid accidental disclosure, maintain vigilance about access to your private notes. Brain imaging showed that people maintaining emotional secrets showed elevated baseline activation in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. indicating constant cognitive monitoring. They were always running a background program checking for threats to their emotional privacy. This chronic cognitive load contributed to mental fatigue, difficulty concentrating, and reduced capacity for other cognitive tasks. The secret keeping itself was exhausting, even before considering the emotional content of the secrets. A 2020 study in psychological science examined what happens when someone discovers another person's private emotional notes accidentally. They created scenarios where participants' private notes were inadvertently seen by roommates, partners, or family members. The emotional response was intense: shame, anger, violation, panic. But here's what's striking. Even when the discoverer responded with empathy and support, the note-keeper reported lasting distress about the exposure. The researchers found that the violation wasn't just about the specific content being seen. It was about the loss of control over who witnessed their emotions. The private notes represented a space where they had complete autonomy over their emotional expression and who had access to it. That space being breached, even accidentally, felt like a fundamental violation of self. Many participants deleted their entire note collection after such incidents, then gradually rebuilt it with even stricter security measures. Now, let's examine the relationship between private emotional notes and actual human connection. A 2019 longitudinal study published in the Journal of Social and Clinical Psychology tracked individuals who kept secret emotional documentation over 2 years, assessing their relationship quality and emotional intimacy. The findings revealed a paradox. On one hand, the private notes seemed to provide emotional regulation that helped participants function in relationships. They could process difficult feelings privately, rather than overwhelming partners with every emotional fluctuation. On the other hand, the notes created what researchers called intimacy simulation, where the person felt like they were expressing emotions and being heard, when in reality they were just talking to themselves. This pseudo-intimacy reduced the perceived need for actual emotional connection. Why risk vulnerability with a real person when you could get some emotional relief from writing? Over time, participants showed declining emotional intimacy in their relationships, even as relationship duration increased. They were physically present with partners, but emotionally isolated, with their truest feelings living only in encrypted files. Research on the content evolution of private notes over time provides crucial insights. A 2021 study published in Cognition and Emotion analyzed note-taking patterns over multiple years. They found that for many individuals, the notes became increasingly dark and negative over time. Early notes might contain a mix of positive and negative emotions, but years later, the notes were almost exclusively repositories for pain, anger, fear, and despair. The mechanism appears to be selective documentation. Positive emotions felt safer to express directly to others, so they didn't need to be documented privately. Negative emotions felt too dangerous to share, so they accumulated in the notes. Over time, the note collection became a concentrated archive of psychological suffering, which the person would occasionally reread, reinforcing their sense that their inner world was too dark and damaged to share with anyone. Let's talk about the specific fear of being too much, because this drives much of secret emotional documentation. Research published in 2020 in the Journal of Personality examined what they called emotional burden beliefs. Many people who kept private emotional notes held strong beliefs that their emotions were too intense, too negative, too frequent, or too complex for others to handle. They saw their emotional expression as a burden that would drive people away. Brain imaging during simulated emotional disclosure showed heightened activation in regions associated with social pain and rejection anticipation. Before they even expressed an emotion, their brain was predicting negative social consequences. The private notes allowed them to express without burdening, to feel without imposing, to exist emotionally without taking up space in others' lives. It was a solution to the problem of having needs in a world where they believed their needs were too much. A 2019 study in Attachment and Human Development found that this too much belief was strongly associated with anxious attachment patterns. Participants described childhoods where their emotional needs were met inconsistently or with visible reluctance. They learned that expressing needs might get them met, but at a cost: the caregiver's irritation, exhaustion, or withdrawal. The child learns to minimize emotional expression to preserve the relationship. The private notes become a way to have the emotional experience without risking the relationship cost. Research on the therapeutic potential of private emotional writing is surprisingly mixed. A A 2020 meta-analysis in Clinical Psychology Review examined expressive writing studies and found that writing about emotions can reduce stress, improve mood, and even enhance immune function. However, these benefits were strongest when the writing eventually led to some form of processing, integration, or action. Writing that remained completely private and was never transformed into interpersonal connection or behavioral change showed diminishing returns over time. The researchers proposed what they called the documentation without integration problem. Writing emotions down provides temporary relief through externalization, but without social validation, cognitive reframing, or behavioral response, the emotions don't fully resolve. They just get stored. The person feels slightly better from having expressed the emotion, but the underlying issues remain unaddressed, leading to repetitive documentation of similar feelings without progress. Let's examine what happens when people try to transition from private emotional notes to actual emotional sharing. A 2021 intervention study published in Behavior Research and Therapy worked with individuals who kept private emotional documentation and wanted to develop more direct emotional expression. The treatment involved graduated exposure, starting with sharing very old notes about resolved situations, progressing to sharing recent notes with trusted individuals, eventually practicing direct emotional expression without writing first. The results showed that change was possible, but difficult. Participants experienced significant anxiety at each stage, requiring extensive support and coping skills. Brain imaging before and after treatment showed reduced amygdala reactivity to emotional disclosure scenarios and increased connectivity between prefrontal regions and limbic areas, suggesting improved emotion regulation. But even after successful treatment, many participants maintained some private note-taking, suggesting it served functions beyond just fear avoidance. Research on the content people wish they could share from their notes is particularly poignant. A 2020 study in the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships asked participants to identify which private notes they most wished someone knew about. The most common categories were expressions of love or appreciation they were too afraid to voice, apologies they felt they couldn't make, anger they thought was unjustified to express, and fears about their worth or lovability. What's striking is that these weren't extreme or inappropriate emotions. They were normal human feelings that the person had deemed too dangerous to share. The notes contained things like, "I wish you knew how much you mean to me. I'm sorry I hurt you. I'm angry that you don't see me. I'm afraid I'm not enough." These are relationship-building communications, but the person's brain had categorized them as threats, relegating them to permanent privacy. A fascinating 2019 study, published in Emotion, examined what happens neurologically when someone rereads their old emotional notes. The researchers had participants reread notes they'd written months or years earlier while undergoing fMRI. When reading notes about resolved situations, there was activation in regions associated with autobiographical memory and perspective-taking, suggesting the person could view their past emotional state with some distance. But when reading notes about ongoing emotional situations, there was reactivation of the emotional neural networks originally engaged when writing the note. The person wasn't just remembering the emotion, they were re-experiencing it. For some, rereading private notes became a form of rumination, repeatedly reactivating painful emotional states without resolution. The notes that were meant to help process emotions were instead preserving and reinforcing them. Let's talk about the digital permanence problem. Unlike paper journals that could be burned or thrown away, digital notes persist. A 2020 study in Computers and Human Behavior examined people's relationships with their archived emotional notes. Many reported conflicted feelings, wanting to delete the notes to move on from past pain, but feeling unable to because the notes represented their authentic emotional history, evidence that their feelings were real. Some participants described their note collections as reaching thousands of entries spanning years. The accumulated emotional documentation became a burden in itself, an archive of pain they carried everywhere on their phone. But deleting felt like erasing themselves, invalidating their emotional experiences, losing the only witness to their inner life. The notes had become both prison and proof of existence. Research on the moment of death provides a dark but important perspective. A 2021 study examined digital legacies and found that many people expressed concern about their private emotional notes being discovered after death. They wanted their feelings to have existed and been real, but they didn't want anyone to actually read them. Some participants had elaborate plans for automatic deletion upon death, trying to solve the paradox of wanting to have expressed emotions without anyone witnessing them. For those watching who keep secret emotional notes, I need you to understand what this pattern represents. It's not organization or healthy journaling. It's a compromise your brain made when emotional expression felt too dangerous. You found a way to have feelings without risking human connection, to exist emotionally without being seen. And while that compromise might have protected you once, it's now preventing the authentic connection that would actually heal the wounds that made expression dangerous in the first place. Your private notes are both safety and prison. They allow emotional expression without vulnerability, but they also ensure you remain emotionally isolated. The deepest parts of you exist only in encrypted files, known only to you, validated by no one. That's not self-sufficiency. That's profound loneliness disguised as protection. Every note you write and hide is a connection you didn't make, a vulnerability you didn't risk, a chance for genuine intimacy you sacrificed for safety. The research shows that secret emotional documentation provides temporary relief but prevents long-term healing. Writing emotions helps you understand them, but understanding alone doesn't resolve them. Emotions exist in relationships. They're meant to be communicated, witnessed, validated, responded to. When you keep them permanently private, you're treating your emotional life as something to be managed alone rather than something that connects you to others. This doesn't mean you should immediately share every private note. That would be overwhelming and potentially harmful. But it does mean recognizing that the pattern of documentation without disclosure is a symptom, not a solution. It's evidence that somewhere in your history, emotional expression became associated with danger, and your brain adapted by creating a workaround. The workaround kept you safe, but it's also keeping you alone. The science is clear. Humans are social beings whose emotional systems evolved to be regulated through connection with others. When you process emotions entirely in isolation, you're working against your neurological design. Your brain needs not just to express emotions, but to have them received, reflected back, validated. That's how emotional wounds heal. Not through private documentation, but through witnessed vulnerability that ends differently than the experiences that taught you to hide. Your notes contain the very emotions that could deepen your relationships if you found safe people to share them with. The love you've never spoken, the hurt you've never named, the fears you've never voiced. These aren't things to hide. They're the raw material of intimacy. But intimacy requires risk. It requires trusting someone with the parts of you that feel most vulnerable. And your private notes are evidence that you've decided that risk isn't worth taking. Maybe you're right. Maybe the people in your life can't be trusted with your emotional truth. But maybe the problem isn't them. Maybe it's that you've never tested whether the danger your brain predicts is still real, or whether you're avoiding vulnerability based on outdated threat models from a past that no longer exists. Your notes are safe, but they're also empty. They receive your emotions but can't respond. They witness without validating. They store without transforming. The question you need to ask isn't whether to keep private notes. It's whether those notes are serving emotional processing or preventing emotional connection. Are they a tool for understanding yourself before sharing with others? Or are they a permanent replacement for human intimacy? Because one is healthy privacy, the other is isolation disguised as self-sufficiency. And the difference determines whether you'll spend your life being truly known or dying with your deepest feelings still locked in files no one will ever read.